Well, evidently Zoom and my computer are not having much fun communicating. And so I'll have to share screens in the next video. But if we look at chapters 1 and 2, and we look at it in English, we see the words that it starts with in the beginning. Then we have the verb was, then we have the word, and then we have repeated and the word, again, was with God, and then repeated and God, the verb was, the word, and he, referencing the word, was in the beginning. And so we have a structure here in which, in the first two verses, whereby the gospel writer indicates there's going to be chiasm within this particular gospel. So this is an A, B, C, D, E, F pattern, which then goes back to F prime, E prime, D prime, C prime, B prime, A prime, showing the repetition. And so at the middle, you have the with God and God. And on the outside, you have in the beginning and in the beginning. And so we have this chiastic structure. Now, the prologue itself is also given in some chiastic structure, as much as 15 points, which would be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, and then pretty much back again. And so depending on how the chiasm is structured, we can kind of understand what is being important. We use this in modern language as well when we talk about things we want you to pay attention to. And so I'm going to tell you about two different things. I'm going to tell you what I want you to do on offense, and then I'm going to tell you about what you want to do on defense. And then I'm going to repeat about being on defense, and then again tell about offense. And by structuring that as offensive, defensive, defensive, offensive, I then give you an idea about what's most important. And what's most important in that case is on the outside, the offense instructions. But that would be a chiastic structure, except we don't use that language in the modern world. And so the prologue has some chiasm, and you'll be reading some articles about that and seeing the diagrams of what that can look like. The second thing that the prologue talks about in terms of themes is Christology. Christology or Christology is the study of the Christ, study of the Messiah. What does it say about the Messiah, and what does it tell us about this one known as the Christ? Now, we're familiar that the early church in the councils declared Jesus at one point to be fully God and fully human. But where in the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, did they get the idea that he was fully God? Great question. You might want to ask that later when we get together. But that concept truly does come from the Gospel of John. In the prologue, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. Later on in verse 14, it says, the Word, which was in the beginning with God, became flesh. Incarnation dwelt among us. And so the deity of Christ is very important in the prologue. And that idea of Jesus being God, with God and God, from the beginning is carried on throughout the discussion in John's Gospel. Another aspect of the Christology is that Christ as the creator. Now, Colossians, in the writings of Paul, gives us some discussion about that Christ, in whom all things were created, and in him all things hold together. But here we have that nothing came into existence apart from the Word. And this takes us right back to the Genesis story. In the beginning is a Genesis account where it says, in the beginning, God created, though it was not God created. In the beginning, the world was, water and this darkness, and the Spirit covered the earth. But then it says God spoke. He said a word. And so John is pulling upon this Genesis tradition that the word is the creative power. And that has a lot to do with the Hebrew and Semitic view of word. We don't always see words as powerful and having power, and yet they have tremendous power to bless and to curse us. We just sometimes deny that it is, thinking that'll make it go away, and it doesn't. And the third main part I just mentioned earlier is the incarnation. The idea of God becoming flesh is a Christological concept that we have in the prologue of John. Soon after the discussion of Jesus' creative powers at the beginning in verse 5, we have an introduction of the Baptist, John the Baptizer. He's even mentioned, right? There was a man named John, and he was a witness, and he was not the light. And so it tells us about who John is and what his role is. And we notice in verses 19 through 34, he carries out that role. But he is a witness to this one, which is very much in line with the synoptics, where John says, I am a voice in the wilderness crying out, prepare the way of the Lord. He is not the Messiah nor the prophet, but simply one speaking a word of preparation. But that introduces then the light, because of John it says he was not the light. Jesus is the light. He is not the light. And so we have the theme of light, and this light was the life of humanity. And so light and life take on a parallel, synonymous appearance in the two. And light doesn't always get talked about throughout the gospel, but life does. So when you think about life and eternal life, as I prefer life of the ages, we see these things. And so in verse 4, we know that the light came, but the darkness was not able to overcome it. And so we have this paradox, perhaps more than dualistic, a extremity of two things, light and darkness, and a pushing back against them. But darkness cannot push back against the light that is Jesus, cannot recognize Jesus, nor can it overwhelm him. And so this idea of light and life and darkness makes a appearance throughout the gospel, sometimes in terms of life, sometimes the world, and sometimes simply darkness. And then we recognize things in this darkness. We find things. We see in verses 9 and 10 of this gospel that the true light, not John, but Jesus, the Word, comes into the world and gives light to everyone, or gives life to everyone. And this light was in the world, but the world did not know him or recognize him, even though he made the world, right? And so we have the issue, the problem of, does the world recognize Jesus or not? And most often it does not. And his disciples don't fully recognize Jesus. And so these themes that are brought out in the prologue shape their way through the gospel, and we'll follow some of them. Another one is glory. Glory is oftentimes thought about light, but there's a very powerful verse when we see this passage, right? Of the Word became flesh, and we saw his glory. Glory like only one from the Father could bring. Glory as of the only begotten from the Father. And this glory, this idea of glory, is a concept that reoccurs at various times. But it goes on and it says there's this glory that is found in grace and truth. This is a hendiasis, a technical term which means two things that are said together that are probably just the same thing. That grace is truth, that truth is grace in this pattern, but this glory is filled with grace and truth. And then later on in verse 17, we finally get the message that this person, this Word who became flesh, and we beheld his glory, has a name. And verse 17 says that the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. So we have a very much of a comparison between verses 14 and 17. You might even think we had chiasm here in this little section, right? But talking about that. And in between this little chiastic parallelism, right? Verse 15, John testifies, this is the one who is coming. This is the one who we have received his fullness. We have received grace. And so there's this issue of John in the middle giving testimony to the light, which is the word, which is given to us through this one that we know as Jesus. And so that's where we're going to pause this video because we don't want them to be overly lengthy. And then John, I can talk about the prologue a great deal. And so it would be great if you found some questions on the prologue. I'd be more than happy to answer those.